Good morning. It was great for me to be here. Okay, so as Sonia said, Carleton is very dear to my heart. I came here in 2011 and I completed my Master's of HCI and Ph.D. in Computer Science at Carleton University. And now I am a lecturer at the University of Waterloo's Stratford Campus. So in terms of design, why this talk is relevant to my background, I actually started off as a student in my undergrad as a graphic designer. I did a 4-year graphic design program at York Sheridan's Joint Programming Design. And after that, I worked in Waterloo for a couple years for a marketing agency. And I kind of started developing interest in research and decided to come back to graduate school. But what I actually noticed in graduate school is that I've worked as a professional designer. Obviously I did kind of design for clients, but even just in my personal work, having that knowledge is hugely beneficial. So for example, as graduate students, you're required to sometimes design a poster at a conference. When I was applying for jobs, I needed to design a very professional looking CV or resume. And just having that knowledge, even the basic knowledge of how to put that material together, right? Something that's very cohesive, that communicates about who I am, and to communicate clearly communicate my research to my viewers as well, if I'm doing, let's say, a conference presentation or a poster presentation. So that's my goal today. I'm not gonna pretend that, after this lecture, you're gonna be a professional graphic designer. But what I wanted to show you is kind of the principles, the tips that you would see in 80% majority of graphic design material that you can apply to your own work. So I want to explain them clearly, that there is actually a strategy. And when you see a piece of good design, you'll be able to articulate exactly why that piece of design is effective or not. And it is also my goal to want you after today's session to be able to apply this in some of your own work. That could be anything, any wide range. You don't have to be, designing a professional piece for someone, but even just apply, let's say, even creating a resume, creating a poster, I think will be very beneficial. Okay. So I'd like to hear a little bit, just briefly, about your own background and in terms of whether you had challenges in the past creating something in terms of design, and what are some of the things you're hoping to gain from today. I don't know if anybody wants to start. Just, yeah, sure.
So my name is Rashmi, and I'm a master's student right now at Carleton University. I just wanted to know what is it all about, the professional designer, and what are your search about it. So
okay.
I was interested, and also I'm looking for a Ph.D.
Okay.
From that perspective also, I've come to this.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
My name is Umar. I'm doing my PhD in IT. I'm looking in different research trajectories, combining human-chemical interaction, game design, education and technology. Currently I work as a user experience researcher at Canadian Intellectual Property Office. Actually, the reason for me being here, I like to be updated with the current trend in the design, and I see the big name and the abstract. Actually, it's catchy. So we hope we can get something out of that. Also, I'm a CLU student, so it's part of the things that we would like to be in the loop.
Okay.
What's going on with that.
Okay.
Hopefully we can.
All right. Did I see Tamara? Do you have something?
Yeah. Obviously, I am not a CLU student. I'm not from a design background, and lots of times I hear stuff and it's very interesting, but it's also very intricate. And so I guess I was just wondering about primary resources, like what somebody like yourself would recommend as the best tools. Because I often find for myself, I'm overwhelmed with all the choices.
Right, yeah. There's certainly a lot of tools out there. And what I often hear from non-designers is that some people will say, like, I know when I see something that's well designed, but I can't really explain why. And when I apply it to my own work, I don't know where to start, okay? So I wanted today to show basically some of the essential principles in design. I'm going to talk about kind of things like layout, maybe to clarify some of these words that you heard before, but don't really know exactly how to apply it, right? So in design, we say things like white space, right? Use white space, but what does it actually mean? Like, why does it actually work, right? So really break that down. So most important visual design principles for creating effective layouts, okay? So we don't have time to cover everything, but I say I'll cover about 80% of the principles that you actually see in most design work. And we can never talk about graphic design without talking about typography. It's not graphic design without typography, so we have to go over it, but I'll show you the common mistakes that I've seen people make over and over. Even with my design students at University of Waterloo, some of them still make some of these mistakes, so I'll go over what that is, okay? I want you to look at this and tell me if you see it. You put up your hand if you see something. Okay, one person. Okay, so it's one of those like tricks, seems like psychologists like to play on people, right? So I'll start this with talking a little bit about Gestalt, right? So it's essentially about, as human beings, how we process information. So this is actually a picture of, very abstract picture of a dog, okay? So his ears and head is here, of a Dalmatian, and then you can see kind of the legs, the body, and he's walking around. Looks like it's some sort of park or scenery. There's like looks like kind of like a tree or a bush there. I know when people start kind of seeing it a little bit. Do you? You still don't see it? Okay. So I'll post the slides. I think we can post the slides later, so take a look, okay? So in general, as human beings, in terms of how our brain read information, right? So even before I told you that there's actually something there, as soon as you see this image, you're automatically start to putting that information together, regardless of whether I told you to or not, okay? This is because the way our brain functions, like we don't really like this type of scattered information. We really want to perceive information as a whole rather than scattered parts. And design, in terms of how we arrange information on the sheets, on the screen or on paper, has to do a lot with our visual perception. Okay, again, some of the perception, the way we read this information, okay? This one here almost looks like the lock monster, okay? So do you see this as 3 different pieces was one continuous piece? 3 separate? Okay, what about 1? Okay, okay. Okay, even though it's 3 different shapes, right? The way that our brain's perceiving that is connected, even though they're not actually connected. Same here. We see this shape as a whole, right? This one, instead of like kind of 3 Pac-Mans facing each other, we're gonna, this shape starts to pop out. Another little bit of a little test. Okay. Are these three completely different images, or are they related? Okay. So one thing is that for computers to do this, to actually tell that this image is somehow related to that image is very difficult, right? Because the shapes are slightly different. Also, the terms that, in terms of how it is put together is different. But as human beings, we know that these look different, but they're probably part of the same group, right? They have similar style. The way they're put together is similar. So we typically perceive these as the same or similar, that they're related. Okay, so the gist of Gestalt is that when we see an image, we generally prefer order over chaos. Okay, our brain was trying to start grouping things together. We really want to organize item into a whole, and we're really, really good at this. Okay, still better than computers. So another example. So this is ASCII art. Okay, in terms of, so look at that. I talk about white space, right? There's white space here. There's white space here. There's white space around that M. So they're all part of the background, right? If you just talk about it as white space. But for some reason, we read that M as part of Mario's hat, right? We don't read that information as part of the background. It's because that's because our visual perception in the works there. So the takeaway is that when you look at a piece of design, okay, basically you're already, I guarantee that every one of people in this room are already using some of those principles. So what I want to show you today is to how do I apply these principles more deliberately, right? Not just by accident. And how do I push these ideas a bit further, okay? So the first principle is the closeness or lack of items that indicate relationships. So this is what I mean, right? So look at these dots. The first one, let's say you had, right now they're dots, but think of it in terms of reading direction, right? Do you read from left to right or top and down? Is there a preference?
I'm different because I have two languages. I read from right to left.
Yeah, or you can write from right to left. But at this point, it's not that clear. Whereas compared to this one, right? You're probably more inclined to read it from top to bottom, right? We see this in everyday design, things like magazine articles. These are essentially our columns, right? When there's a space between the columns, we group that segment of the text together. Similar with that, okay? So instead of reading these as 4 separate dots, 2 separate dots, and 3 separate dots, we group them together as a whole. Okay, so this is I'll show you a really neat trick in design. I find this immensely useful. So without even reading this text, okay, I want you kind of squint your eyes, okay? Squint till you can't, to the point that you can't really read the smaller text. And I want you to count how many items on this page, okay? Okay? So which one stands out the most? Probably the center one, okay, because it's big, okay? Squint your eyes again, look at this. Where does your eye go next? Okay, top left, partially because of our reading habits, right? We start with the top, right? But what if I want people to go here, right? But chances are after that, your eyes might start just darting around because I see these shapes, okay? So commonly what people do when they start looking at a design material, they don't see the text right away. They'll start seeing these as texture and kind of dark and light shapes, right? So if I can't immediately, if I look at this, and of course this is a very simple design, right? There's not that much text. So I started to kind of look these in terms of how dark they are, where they're placed, and then my eyes will start darting around some of these cards, okay? So do the same with the next one, right? Squint your eyes, you start seeing in terms of a hierarchy, it's a lot more clear, right? In terms of where I start, where I go next. And another interesting thing is that the difference between that one and this one is the information here is grouped. Can you tell me why this is grouped here? Why would you put that together?
Because of the space. The first one, we had space between the informations.
Yeah. But what's this information about? Contact, right? So it's intellectually related information, okay? So one trick we use to design is that in terms of how we want to basically people to interpret this information is that intellectually and conceptually related information probably should be grouped together, and this can be done by how close they are to each other, right? So this is probably about where it is, okay? Maybe this is the name of my business, and this is my contact information group together. So tip is, when you look at a piece of design, and we'll do this a few times throughout this, this lecture, is that count the number of visual elements, right? And count the number of times your eye stops at a page. And you can tell, let's say if you had a poster at a conference, from far away, what type of information pop out. Okay, so I'll show you a couple examples of what that may look like, okay? Okay, I want you here, it's a little flyer about, looks like a book club, okay? So let's say you saw this posted somewhere at a library. Is their winter reading schedule. I want you to tell me how many readings that they have on this ad for this book club. Okay, I heard 3. Do people see 3? Okay, so let me know where you found the number of readings are in this.
What do you mean by number of readings?
So for example, their winter reading schedule, right? So I want to know how many books that they're reading. Yeah. Do people see it? Yeah? 2, okay. Somebody else said 3, okay. Okay, so the point is you're probably reading the actual content, right? If I come across this at the library, I read heading, First Friday Club winter reading schedule, okay, for a book club. So that's interesting. I wonder what books they're reading, right? So we're actually reading this line by line. If I want the viewer to dissect this information really quickly, okay, I could change the design to something like this, okay? The point here is that I want people to be able to scan this information really fast, right? So let's say it took us, like at least 30 seconds okay? Maybe 20, 30 seconds. So the fastest person maybe took 20 seconds to read this information and to actually tell me how many readings that this book club is actually, what kind of books that they're reading, okay? If I presented them like this, using things like contrast, which we'll talk about a little bit later, by grouping, just simply by grouping information together. So I have a title, I have my description, and I'm fairly sure that some of you are already doing this in your papers, right? You have a heading, and you have a description that's related to their particular title. So we all agree that that one is a lot easier to read. Okay, similar here. University of Waterloo's Stratford Campus. So we're a satellite campus located in Stratford. Stratford is known a lot for like Shakespeare, for just theater and plays in general, and there's a lot of Shakespeare plays. So with this first advertisement, right, you look at how this information is grouped. So the title, in terms of proximity, it's not as clear as to, let's say, this one, whether it is, right? Before I start reading this content, whether this one is related to the one on top or related to the one on the bottom. Simply because the proximity, the space here, compared to the space here, they're exactly the same, okay? So this is an easy fix. If I just make the description below the heading closer, only because they're related, I can start grouping this information a lot easier. Okay. So things to avoid in design in terms of their proximity with each other is that avoid having too many different elements, separate elements on the page. So try to group images together and with text. And everything should be intellectually related, right? Information that are related, try to group them together, and you're going to come up with something that's a little bit more professional. Leaving equal amounts of white space between elements. This will ultimately confuse your viewers because they're not sure which content belongs to what. Okay. And confusion, right? Again, it has to do with how close they are related together. I want to know when a heading is related to a paragraph or a caption or a graphic, it should look like it actually belongs to that material. Lastly is that grouping things together that actually are not related at all in terms of content, okay? This is, okay, the last point is like something I see a lot of amateur designers do is that embrace kind of the areas where there's nothing there, right? White space, we talk a lot about this in design, I'm sure you've heard of it before. It's actually a really good thing, right? So sticking things in the corners just because it's empty, that's something to avoid. So you want to basically group your information together. Okay, the next principle I want to talk about is alignment, okay? Alignment essentially means every item should have a visual connection with something else. Okay, so when we look at, you know, people have look at any type of design, okay? Imagine the trick you can do, and this is a little self-test, is that imagine there's an invisible line that connects every single element on your page, okay? So again, with a business card, okay, of course these lines are just something I like putting, but start looking at how they're related, right? Actually take a ruler and to see, do they actually align, right? And minor kind of misalignments like this. So this is just slightly misaligned to that, and this is slightly misaligned to this, okay? This actually really bothers our brain, okay? When we see something like this, immediately it won't look as professional. It's because if they're really different, we can tell, okay, so that was done deliberately. But if it just slightly misaligned, it looks like that was done by mistake. Okay, so things like this. This one has more of a center alignment. Okay, in most cases you have 3 choices, right? Stuff could be left aligned, it could be center aligned, and it can be right aligned, right? In design we call this flush right. Left is flush left, and center just called centered. 3 choices. Okay, it should be fairly easy to pick one that works for you. Okay, but in general, a lot of beginners like to use center alignment, right? We see a lot of this on my students' term papers, right? Center, it just feels very safe, right? Center everything, but if you make it left aligned, a lot of times it actually just looks a lot more professional than a centered aligned piece. Okay, and of course this, we're using alignment, but we're also using proximity, right? So that's the title of my paper, this is my name and the date, depending on how they're related. So tips are things like, rather than choosing 3 different alignment, okay, just use one. Okay, your papers are going to be a lot more professional. Choose one alignment, make your alignment really strong. Okay, when it's flush right, check, especially things like this, bullet points on your resume, different graphical elements. Does it have a strong alignment? And always find something else on the page to align with, right? If you look at, oops. Sorry. Okay, business card. Okay. If I already placed this phone number here, this one should be aligned to that, right? So always find something on the page to align your elements with. Okay. So flush left, flush left, flush right versus center. With center aligned text, another kind of risk, you started seeing your mind starting seeing these weird shapes, right? This is, in design, we call this a rag, the way that's ragged, and you start to kind of see this like bottle shape, and that could be undesirable, right? You could use it as a design element. Sometimes I'll see in advertisement this is deliberately done, I actually have a box in the shape, let's say, of a bottle. Maybe the article is something about, I don't know, something related to bottles. And I fit my text within that contour, and that's done deliberately. But if it's done by accident like that, that shape is just really distracting to me, right? That just depends on how my text is broken up. So let's look at this, okay? This piece, okay? Compared to that one, right? So look at the alignment. So if using that trick that I said about taking a ruler and just draw a line and to see where these items actually fit, right? So this is actually what it looks like. So there I have 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, 5, 6, 7, 8, okay, 8 alignment, and I have this rag going on, right? So basically, it's a little bit random. And again, I mentioned in terms of Gestalt, this bothers us, right, visually, because our brain really prefers order over chaos. So if I were to take the tip, if you're not exactly sure how to use alignment like an expert, if you just choose one, that will make your design look a lot more professional. Okay? So avoid using more than one alignment on the page. Okay? So choose left, center, or right. I don't mean that just because I said center alignment can be unprofessional. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use center alignment, right? There's lots of really good designs with really beautiful center aligned graphical elements and text, but when you want to use it a little bit more deliberately. Like know for a fact that, okay, consciously that I'm using a center alignment, and what is my reason for using it, right? Center alignment, yeah, unless you're trying to create a very, very kind of this formal, conservative look, choose it more consciously and not just by default. Okay, the third one I want to talk about is repetition. Right? Repetition essentially just means repeating some aspect of your design consistently throughout your layout. Okay? This can be you can think of it as consistency. So it could be any element. It could be textual or graphical elements. So it could be using the same font in another section of your layout. It could be something like a thick rule or a thin line, a certain bullet design element, a certain color or spatial arrangement. Okay, so with here, okay, this layout compared to this layout. Okay, just squint your eyes again. Okay, the second design after the first one. Right? I can tell like this looks really dark, right? So my eyes probably goes there first. And the second largest element, I'm basically repeating the boldness of that, because I think as a designer, this is done, if I were to do this deliberately, is that I want people to read my phone number next because I want them to contact me, then I would use repeating that bold in my phone number, right? So instead of reading from top to bottom. So in this design, I would probably read this, then this, then this, then this, right? Whereas this, I would want my phone number to really stand out. I could repeat an element I'm already using, and this would make a really kind of consistent look. So there's certain elements that you're already using, right? So things like in our papers, chances are you're already using things like headings and paragraphs, right? So this one, I'm using all caps, right? In the first title, and then also headings that are using a typeface that's just slightly bigger than the body text. So I'm already doing these things, right? But in this case, I'm making it a lot stronger, right? First of all, it's not just a little bit bigger. It's actually, I can tell that this is definitely a lot bigger than that, okay? And also, I applied a different color. My text, in terms of alignment, it's aligned up here, and I have the title at the very top. And if you take a look, again, squint your eyes, that you can tell the second layout in terms of where the paragraph starts and ends. It's a lot more easier to read. Okay. Okay, in this case. Okay, actually, before I show you that, okay, I want you to tell me in terms of design principles I just talked about. What type of things are they using here?
Grouping, different alignments.
Yep.
Shapes.
Yep. Yeah. So the bold is being repeated. There's two different alignments.
I
Okay.
don't understand why you put after the matter that in a bullet point 1 to 11, because that looks out.
Yeah, yeah. So that could be out of place, right? That's one of the design decisions you're making, right? So repetitive elements. So things like bold typeface. Okay, I have a lighter typeface. I have a repeated square bullet. I have indent, spacing, and alignment. Okay, so one thing is like, especially with my design students, let's say you want to design a business card, a letterhead. You know, do these elements have to be exactly the same? Am I simply just like copy and pasting my design styles, right? So one thing that you can see is with this example is that they do not have to be exactly the same. I'm simply repeating a few things here, right? There are 3 unique pieces. Looks very different, but I can tell that they're part of the same design material, right? So the things I'm repeating here are the typeface, okay? The little characters here, they're very different, but they're of the same style, okay? I'm repeating this orange color and this kind of square, even though they're different sizes, the square element as part of the background. Okay? So they do not have to be exactly same, but pick 1 or 2 things that you want to repeat throughout your material is if it's part of a package, okay? And your design is going to look a lot more consistent. So chances are when you're designing a communication piece, there's different elements. I just give the example of business cards and cover letters, right? There's some aspect of it just in terms of your personal brand. You want to make them look like it's part of the same person, right? If I give you a business card versus a cover letter, I can tell that they're part of the same communication piece from the same person. So things to avoid are repeating the same elements so much it becomes annoying and overwhelming. So we kind of do this already in terms of how we dress, right? So I want you to picture this, right? Somebody wearing a black outfit, okay? But they have a red hat, red earrings, red lipsticks, red scarf, red handbag, red shoes, and a red coat, right? We can already start picturing what this person is like. It's like, okay, you really like red. It's like a little bit too much, right? We see often this in like fashion advice or makeup advice, right? If you're wearing like a very bright color, to make that color stand out, to actually look like is a well-intended design element, you don't want to overdo it, right? So in this case, if we're just an evening drive with a red hat, that might be a very, very pleasing look, right? So we're all kind of consciously doing this in some way or the other, and we just have to apply this into our design pieces as well. Contrast, so this is a really, really important one, right? I talked about in a previous example where we have a heading that just may be slightly bigger than my body text. Let's say I'm using a 10-point font for my body text and my heading is 11-point, right? So contrast is basically about the difference, how different they look between 2 elements. If I want to make something different, you want to make them really different. Right? So we're not kind of battling to trying to guess, are these part of the same element or different elements? So it can be created in many different ways, right? I can contrast a larger typeface versus a smaller one. I can contrast a warm color with a cool color. So there's different ways you could do this, right? Spacely, widely spaced elements compared to really tightly spaced elements. But you kind of don't want their, sort of barely there contrast. You want something to be very obvious, the deliberate when you want to use contrast, right? So here's the example, right? I have 10, okay? I have one type set in 110 point, okay? This one is just a little bit smaller. But my immediate impression, even though they're 10 points apart, right, in terms of size, my immediate impression that they almost look the same, right? But there's something about them that's just slightly different. But in terms of our brain trying to tell these two apart, it bothers us, right? There's something about it. With this design here, right? Okay, this is slightly thinner than that, okay? So those are the type of things you want to avoid, right, in terms of contrast. So these are the rules I'm putting in the middle of my design, okay? But this is actually separates the heading from my content, okay? So probably this one, even though the designer says, okay, so I want to make this thicker than the ones that are in this box. But they didn't do it, it's not strong enough for me to tell that apart, okay? So what you want to do is perhaps something like this, okay? If you want to make the thickness different, then make it really different, okay? That's the main point of contrast. And the heading at this point, contrast, right? It's a lot, I'm using a very dark background for my heading. So that gives me a very, very high contrast. Okay, so a couple of things to remember. If you're making two items different, really avoid like kind of this wimpy, barely different approaches, and just make them really, really different, right? So in this case, another example. Okay. The one on the left, of course, it's not necessarily a poorly designed piece, right? It still looks professional. But your goal is that when I'm glancing this information, I'm just looking at this information, right? I want immediately to be able to communicate what each of this paragraph is about. And we all know that people don't like to spend a lot of time reading. They actually, when they look at a piece, they start to, you start picking out information. Does this article looks interesting to me, right? Am I actually interested in reading exciting headlines, right? If it's a really exciting headline, I want to grab people's attention. Maybe it's something, breaking news, right? If that jumps out to me, then I'm like, oh, like I want to, I'll be interested to read forward, right? About what that's about what that content is. And again, I'm using contrast at the top. And with my headings, it's a lot easier to tell, okay? So with here, right, I can tell for sure this is part of, this is a subheading, okay? This is another heading, and this is a subheading, okay? Okay, so that communication should be instant, okay? They should be able to instantly understand what is going on. And contrast, of course, creates that visual interest, right? We look at the ones with the dark, kind of the dark heading. It looks like it's creating a lot of visual interest. And it also creates hierarchy in terms of what I want to read next, what information is grouped along with certain headings. Okay, so this is something that we probably all have to do at some point, creating a resume, okay? If I am an employer getting this resume, okay, I might be interested to read all of the content, but if I have, let's say, 100 resumes on my table, right, I might not be able to read this entire thing, right? I might just start skimming, right? So basically I want to know things like, what is your employment history? What experience do you have? Where did you graduate, right? What educational background do you have, right? So of course, we all know how to read. That's not impossible, but what's this person's background? Can someone tell me? I realize it's a little bit small, but. Okay, so accomplishments, I have a profile, I have my education, right? College of Art. Yeah. So if I want to improve this, right? If I want to make this immediately accessible, within 10 seconds, I would understand what this person, basically the highlights, right? So you could do something like this, okay? Using a lot of contracts and grouping information, immediately, right, these are highlights, okay? So I know this person, okay, oh, English teacher, okay? Web designer, developer, interesting, okay? Daycare professional, okay? Musician. Bachelor of Arts in printmaking, graphic design, and drafting. So that's the educational background. Professional affiliations, okay? And languages. So maybe those are things I think are crucial to part of my role for this job. So those are some of the things I might highlight. But if I were to getting that piece as an employer, right, it doesn't take me, basically takes me no time at all to skim through that content to immediately understand, right? Of course, those might initiate my interest, and I'm going to read the information accompanying that particular heading. So that's the point in terms of how your information, how you want to portray your information, right? Your goal is to, how do I make that information I want to communicate immediately accessible and readable? Okay, one of the other things I want to talk about is I see sometimes a design on a really dark background, okay? So in general, darker backgrounds, it's very visually striking, right? You have a lot of contrast, but generally not recommended for a very long piece of text, right? So you would never want to set, let's say, a novel in black, yeah, on the background. This is because, like, when we start reading this, actually, if you ever had experience reading text set on a dark background on a website, you notice you started getting a little bit of eye strain, right? The reason for that is when it's on a dark background, it almost as if you think about stars in the sky, it almost starts to look like the text is almost like twinkling, right? With that contrast, it just too much eye strain. It's a very striking layout, right, in terms of contrast, but it's generally not recommended for very long format text, okay? I see a lot of dark designs for short format layouts, and they can be very effective. So there's a bit of trade-off between readability and in terms of what visual impact I have, so make that conscious decision. So generally things avoid, right, just the barely there contrast. Okay. Sort of heavy line with a sort of heavier line. Avoiding contrast, things like brown text with black text. Okay. They're both dark, right, even though they're visually a little bit different. Using two or more typefaces that they're similar. If items are not exactly the same, then make them very different. Okay, and also avoid lots of text on a really dark background. Okay, so design principles, I kind of talked about them in isolation, but they're almost always used together, right? So let's look at an example. Okay. Again, we already know some of this, right, in terms of why this is poorly designed. So how would you improve it in this case? If you're asked to redesign this particular menu.
I think it's grouping and the white space and the lines.
Yeah.
There should be gaps.
Yep. Yeah. So maybe grouping, let's say all of my starters, right? It's grouped together. All of my entries is grouped together. That's simply just logical, right? In terms of those information is related. Yep. Yeah. So maybe color. Anything else? Uppercase. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So when we talk about typography, we'll talk about a little bit about all caps, but in general, they're harder to read, right? So maybe, and also in terms of contrast, it's not that great because it's all caps for my headings plus my body text. So I might want to make them different. So let's look at the second example, okay? It's definitely improved, right? It's definitely an improvement. So we talked a little bit about the grouping from information. So I have my particular starter, the name of the starter, the price, and a short description. And I have my entrees, and those are different, okay? And if I were to improve this a bit more, right? Here I'm using the principle of proximity and putting things slightly together. Want to improve this more, I can use things like alignment, right? So here I'm using these things, right? Proximity, how close elements are to each other, alignment, okay? So you immediately able to tell that there's two sections to this menu, right? On starters, on entrees, there's definitely some contrast and definitely some repetition, right? In terms of my font choice, the color I'm using. And if I want to make this, okay, can people tell me if you want to improve this even further? What would you do? Make this even easier to read.
I think it's too much of purplish color.
Okay, that color. Okay, so maybe the color is a little bit too much, or just all the same. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you could do that, right? Right now, I still have to look at, it's like, you know, if someone's buying me dinner, it's like, what's the most expensive dish they have on this menu, right? And then in this case, I'm still have to look at it one by one, right? So I can align the numbers, right? Okay, so maybe it looks something like that, right? Couple different things. So someone said, like, okay, so this color here, okay, maybe the color is not an issue, but simply because the contrast is a little bit too similar. So maybe I choose a much lighter typeface where I can make the actual name, the dish, pop out a little bit more. I can use different alignment techniques by using flush left for my menu items and flush right for my the prices on here. Okay, so I can tell New Zealand rack of lamb is the most expensive dish on this, right? Or if I'm a budget, I can tell, right, the least expensive is $7, which is a salad. So here I have very strong proximity, right? I'm using these basically maximize the advantages of each of these principles. There's alignment, there's a lot of contrast, and there's a lot of repetition, right? Okay. So if you have a piece of paper, if you don't, okay, just take a minute. I have some papers here. So you can find some differences between these two, right? I think we can all agree that the right one is better designed. It's a very simple layout, right? We're just working with purely text. But what are some of the differences between these two layouts? Yeah. So see, you can jot it down. Yeah. And then Okay, what's a couple of differences that you wrote down? Want to share it their list? Yeah.
First one has a frame, the other one not frame.
Okay.
The title in the first one, I like it, but it's not in bold. While in the other one, I was hoped to organize the title in a different way. The grouping in the second one, it's more clear. You can see there is a good use of the white space. Alignment, using bold, it's obvious. The other one, the first one, for example, sometimes there is no consistent on the format. Sometimes they use bold point, even the bold point for the second point is not right. Let's start with
Yep. Other people have more observations, maybe that we missed.
There's repetition and there's a contrast.
Okay. Yeah. So repetition, things like bullet points, and you use a bold. Okay. Yeah. But this, of course, is a very simplified version, right? But you can see a lot of these principles at work here, and you can apply it to basically any type of layout just by following these kind of 4 principles, and automatically your designs will look a lot more professional. Okay, of course, this is obviously, like, I guarantee none of you are that bad, but the one on the right is a lot more easier to read, and just by using, if you're using contrasts, make them really different. Like advices like that, I think would be helpful. So in design, we always say, rules are always meant to be broken, right? When you have more practice and experience with this, right? Sometimes when you do something outside of the box, your design could look very, very fresh, very new, and unconventional, and that could be a good thing. But when you start breaking the rules, so if I were, like, let's say our first year design students, I might want to do these things by the book, just to try them out to see whether they're effective, and then once I know what the rules are, I can break it, but I need to know what the rules are first, right? So these are the basic rules of design. Okay. The second part, I want to talk about typography, because I said we cannot talk about graphic design without going into some information about typography. Okay. There's basically 2 groups of typefaces, okay, or fonts. One is the serif, and we all know what Time New Romans are, okay? So difference between serif versus a sans serif. So serif essentially means little feet. So we see these fonts have these handles, right? They have these handles, and they're kind of little feet at the end of the stroke. Whereas sans serifs are typefaces like Helvetica, where we have a very kind of more geometric look, right? There's kind of different designs in terms of details and how kind of angle and severe some of these strokes look. Depends on the type of font, right? So, but every single font will typically fall into these category, okay? Helvetica, if you look really closely, you notice that I said geometric, but Helvetica is actually a little bit more on the humanistic side of sans serifs. Okay, there is some variations, even though slightly, between the thickness and the thinness of the strokes. That there's a little bit of variation, just to give it, like, make it a little bit more softer, a little bit more humanistic, okay, compared to other sans serif fonts where it's very, very, very geometrical, almost look like it just feels a little bit colder. And with serifs, some of them you see like a very, less or more curves, okay. Depends on the font that you choose. There's another category called display. Okay. Display, you see a lot of these kind of fancy fonts, right, in the font libraries. They generally mimic textures or objects. So this is a fairly popular one. It's like, oh, it looks kind of cool. It's like imitating my chalkboard, kind of text written on the chalkboard. So with display, generally with your serifs and sans serifs, these are a lot more readable, right? I think we can all agree that they're a lot more readable than something like this, right? So display, use them only for headings, for titles, very, very short format text, and never use a display typeface for a body text, okay? There's also another category called monospace, okay? So we look at the other typefaces, right? Helvetica, the I is a lot more thinner than my H, right? So the L and I takes up the same space, whereas there's wider. There's no W on here, but I suspect my W and my M's will be the widest. Whereas monospace, every single letter is exactly the same space. And this might be useful, let's say if I want to create a layout where I want the letters to line up from the different lines of letters to line up exactly. Let's say maybe it's for a logo or something where I need to stack my text. And this might be useful for that. So of course in typography, professional designers use all kinds of terms, right? You obviously don't have to become an expert at this, but there's a few that you should know. One of them is leading, okay? Leading, I think you should know, is essentially the space between two lines of text, right? You can have more leading in a paragraph where your lines are more spaced apart, we have tighter leading. There are things like kerning, okay? You can dictate how much space there is between letters. And there's the X height, okay? X height is essentially, it's called an X height because it's the height of the letter X in that font set. And you find that some typefaces will have a higher X height, they look taller than others. And in terms of readability, there's a difference, okay? So I'll be referring to some of these terms when I talk about what I'll talk about next. So we have leading, kerning, X height. So I think that those are the most important ones for you to know, okay? Okay, so with text, I think an important aspect with text is that we often don't treat them as graphical elements, right? We often think of text as a block of characters, right? But on a visual design piece, even an essay that you've written, if you start treating them more like graphical elements, you can start dictating start to understand exactly how it looked, right? So I want to use that same technique of squinting your eyes. So I want to just, don't even bother reading that. That's not important, but just look at these three blocks of text by squinting your eyes, right? When it becomes blurry. Can you tell that some of those appear darker?
Black.
Yeah. Some of them appear darker than the others, okay? Even though they are all set in black, right? They use the exact same color, but in terms of just, well, there's a couple differences, right? The weight of this, so this will probably appear the darkest, second darkest, that one's the lightest. There's a couple of things, okay, that you can use to manipulate how dark this looks, this paragraph, right? First of all, you can use a darker font. So this is Arial black. It has a thicker weight than Arial. Therefore, it will appear darker. And if you increase the leading, so again, leading is the space. So it's the space between lines of text. If you increase the leading, meaning that there's more white space in between lines, your block of text will appear lighter, okay? So why is this relevant for design? So we talked about things like contrast, right? So if you want to create more contrast, let's say between your heading or between different elements on your page, you can use contrast, not just in terms of individual, individual characters, but apply them to chunks and blocks of information. An easier way just to use a lighter, I guess more straightforward, you can just simply use a lighter weight font, because every kind of font we download, or I should say, okay, so here's the thing, I should explain. So difference between typeface and font, we also hear those used interchangeably. So it's really doesn't matter that much how you call them, but in general, a typeface, let's say it's Times New Roman is a typeface, but when you download Times New Roman, there's like bold, italic, sometimes there's semi-bold, there's sometimes there's a lighter typeface, a lighter font. Those are called fonts. Okay, so typeface is kind of the category of the fonts, and then you have the different weight, and we generally call those fonts. But they're used interchangeably in industry. Really doesn't matter what you call them. Some people call them fonts, some people call them typeface. I even use them interchangeably sometimes, but in general, those are the technical definition. So Times New Roman is a typeface, and the different categories within Times Roman, those are called fonts. Have people had the pleasure of ever using a typewriter? Yeah? What was it like? Can you describe your...
It was hard to type, but you had to get practice on it. And yeah, it was even, I would say, mostly the way I've shown it was to type better in the letters.
Yeah. What were some of the constraints? Let's say if you want to emphasize a word, how would you do it on a typewriter? What's that? Press harder, you said? Okay. So I actually never personally used one myself, but I remember my
do my job, but
okay.
I just used it just for the thing so that I can just type faster.
Okay. I remember that my dad had one in the middle of 80s. I think he had to borrow one because he was applying for universities abroad, and he wanted to type a professional letter to send. So I remember he borrowed a typewriter. So from what I can understand is that if you, let's say, want to emphasize something, right? Now we have all kinds of typeface. We can have like bold, we can have underline, we can make italics. But so the only way back then to emphasize something is to use all caps, right? All caps. And I still see people do this today, right? They want to emphasize something, they use all caps. And of course it was monospaced, right? So my period takes up the exact same place, same space as the widest letter in the set, which is a W or an M. So it is monospaced, and typically people left 2 spaces after the period, right? So my point is, a lot of our typesetting habits came from this, right? I remember in high school, my teachers all insisted I would put 2 spaces after my period. So anybody still do this? Okay. 2 spaces after my period, after the period, okay? So I want you to do the squint test, okay? Squint your eyes until this kind of becomes blurry. Okay? What do you see after the period? Like, does it look like really wide? Yeah. To me, it almost looked like there's like a huge gap, right? In this case, it's 2 spaces. I guarantee you, just go through any professionally designed magazine, any professionally set book, that you never see 2 spaces after a period. It's always 1 space, right? So this is one of those things that professional designers do, is that we want to use 1 space after a period. It just mostly the reason is aesthetics, right? We don't have these kind of weird gaps in between. in between characters after the period. And also, we are no longer under the constraint of a typewriter, right? So a lot of these habits came from it, but times certainly have changed, and we have no reason really to retain those habits because it just doesn't look very good. So the first rule that will set you apart is one space after punctuation. I think that's something everybody can do very, very easily. So here's the proof, okay? If you squint your eyes, the first paragraph has 2 spaces after punctuation. Second paragraph has 1 space. Okay, if you just take a look. So what I'm hoping now you see, the second one, yeah, it flows better, right? We don't have kind of these abrupt breaks after a punctuation. That's all simply by removing a space after my period, right? We don't have this, if we think back, these not as paragraphs, but more like texture, more as a graphical element. The second one is more aesthetically pleasing. We don't kind of have these holes between punctuations and the next letter. Okay, so this is another thing I see, okay, is that, so I often see this. So in terms of quotation marks, okay, right? Okay, so basically what I drew is this, okay? Okay, so first of all, those are not quotation marks, those are like inch signs, okay? So designers call those dumb quotes because they're not true quotation marks, okay? You never really see this professionally set on a document, okay? So one thing that can help you remember is that quotations, regardless of the typeface you use, should always look like 6s and 9s, right? So they should either look like this, okay, or look like this. Okay, 6s and 9s. And there's, right now our software is getting really good. So if you punching an inch sign, say if it's an apostrophe, it would actually, yeah, sorry, yeah, 6s. So either look like this, okay, they almost look like little 6s and looks like little 9s. That's what I meant. Oh, sorry, yeah. I drew this wrong. Yes. Not a backward 6, but a 9. Yeah. Like this. Yeah, thank you. Our software, as I said, it's getting really good. So you generally don't have to do this yourselves. Most software program would, if you type in an inch sign, it would just correct it for you. It will insert an actual proper quotation mark. So most of the time you don't even have to worry about this, but just be conscious of it, right? If it doesn't correct it for you, there's usually you have to go change the settings. We're going into the glyphs library and actually pick the proper quotes. And apostrophes, the same thing. Okay. Okay, apostrophes, they're always shaped like 9s. Okay, so let's take a look at this example. So we're talking about rock and roll. Okay, which is the correct? So first of all, what is it replacing? Right? And, okay. So every time you insert an apostrophe, it just means you're replacing a character, right? In this case, I'm replacing the A and the D. I see this sometimes, right? Rock and roll. So if you want to remember, the way to do it correctly is that apostrophe always look like lines. Okay? So the right one is the correct way to use it. Okay? So I know these are like very, very minor things, but in terms of professionalism, how these are said, once you learn them, you start noticing them when you look at a unprofessionally designed piece, and it will guarantee it will start bothering you. Things like huge spaces between periods, you start noticing that everywhere. Okay. So this is a big one as well. I see this often, is that students don't quite know the difference between dashes and hyphens, right? So if you notice, there's these kind of lines in any program, right? Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, whatever, any program, you see these lines, right? Some of them will look a little bit wider, some of them will look a little bit thinner. So what's the difference and when do I actually use it? What's the proper way of using these things, okay? So first thing, a hyphen, okay? So this is, a hyphen is the shortest line that you usually have in the character set. They're only used for hyphenating words or line breaks, right? Okay, so here are some examples. My last name, okay, have a hyphen, so Zhang-Kennedy, I would use the hyphen. So some examples are things like odd-looking creatures, Merriam-Webster dictionary, those are hyphenated words, right? So, and what's a dash, right? So essentially there's three. So let me redraw this. There's my hyphen, which is the shortest, and then there's a dash that's a little bit shorter but a little bit longer than the hyphen, and a dash that's a lot longer than the hyphen. Okay, so there's two different dashes. So these are dashes. One is called a N dash, and the other one is called a M dash. N dash it stands for the shorter one. So in general, where it came from is the length of the letter N in that character set, and the M dash is the wider one, and that's generally the width of the M, so the widest character in that character set. Okay, so the N dash. So when should you use this one? That's just slightly wider than the hyphen. So this is used when you want to indicate a duration. Okay. So think of it as the word to. So we see example like October, and then I use a hyphen, December. We read this as October to December, right? And 7 to 12 years of age, 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. Okay, San Francisco to, okay, Chicago. So this one, in these cases, you want to use the N dash. Okay. And another thing to remember is that you don't need a space on either side of the dash. Okay. You do not need a space. So here's an example of it in action with a hyphen. Okay. So the way I would read that is high stress to high energy lifestyle. Okay, I'm using a hyphen and a N dash in that case. Okay, and the last one is the longest dash, which is the M dash. So there is usually only one instance you will use in M dash, is that when you want to indicate a abrupt thought or changes in a sentence. So we see examples like this, okay? The goat fell off the wagon again, right? So you use this dash when you feel like a period, perhaps in terms of how you want to communicate that sentence, is too weak. And a period is too strong. You don't want a different sentence, but a comma might be too weak, right? So this might be a proper way. Yeah.
Should the end dash ever have a space on either side?
So you don't need it for either. Yeah, you don't need it for either. Yeah.
What about interrupting phrases in the sentence? Usually autocorrect has an M dash, but then the latter one becomes a normal hyphen. Like when you're saying something including but not limited to, and then continue the sentence. So before including, there would be an M dash,
Okay.
and then but not limited to, there's a hyphen. Is that correct?
But not limited to. So hyphen, it's not a proper way, so it would be an M dash.
And that's
Yeah.
on both sides.
Yeah. So basically, the N dash is used to indicate a duration, right? So you will read N dash as almost as you're speaking to, right? So San Francisco to, right? Or in this case, okay, pre-Vietnam War, so that would be an N dash rather than a, okay. Okay, so either one, you do not need a space on either side of the dash, okay? Generally in the professionally print pieces or websites, you don't see the spacing between. Okay, all caps, well, we saw examples of that, right? I personally have trouble reading all caps, and there's a reason for it, okay? So if you can picture, okay, in terms of how I like to explain that is that, let's say if I just turn off the lights in this room, it's just, I can only see your silhouette and not your face, okay? You all look slightly different, right? It just depends on your height, your hair, you know, whether you wear glasses, sometimes I can see like a corner, whether you have short or long hair, whether you're wearing, like what you're wearing, it's a different shape, right? But if I were put people in a line and they're all wearing the exact same thing, they're exactly the same height, exactly the same hairstyle, I can't tell them apart, right? So you can think of all caps like that, right? The top, the letters are almost the same, okay? They're they're blocky, right? So in terms of how our brain kind of interprets this information, we have to work a lot harder to read that text. So we tend to almost read it letter by letter rather than as a really quickly by skimming this paragraph. Obviously, it's not impossible, right? I can certainly read this. It just perhaps takes me a bit longer and I have to work a little bit harder. So about the silhouette I was talking about, okay? They have a very similar shape. If I think about lowercase letters, you can almost think of it as the skyline you see over a city in the dark, right? You can tell that there's some high buildings, low buildings, so it's very distinct. And that just simply makes it easier, a little bit easier to read for me. Okay, so that's all caps. In general, lowercase is much easier to read. Uppercase difficult, but uppercase certainly because it's a lot more. It looks in terms of contrast a little bit bigger and a little bit more bold than lowercase. You can certainly use it for things like headings, okay, or a very very short paragraph perhaps to show emphasis. But generally not recommended for setting a huge block of text where I have to do a lot of reading. Okay, underline, this is important especially if you're doing user interface design, right, on websites. We know that when in terms of our expectations, when a certain word is underlined, we generally interpret it as a link, okay? So especially with the design on the web and generally, since there are other choices to create emphasis, generally don't use an underline to create emphasis, because people, especially on the computer, people will tend to read that as a link, okay? Because there's tons of other choices. You can use italics, you can use bold, you can use a different typeface, so try not to use a underline. And there's a proper way of using underlines, okay? Microsoft Word sometimes is a fault of this, okay? If you look at the first one, so if I just press the, sometimes if I just press the underline, right? Sometimes the software, if it's not a professional design software, it just kind of sticks the line under in terms of where my descenders for my P is. You see where the bottom of the P and the line are kind of getting squished. They're a little bit too close together. Okay, and it's not as aesthetically pleasing. Okay? If the font that you're using is kind of really big like this, you can, if there's enough difference between where the line sits and then where the bottom of the P and the F is, you can certainly use it, but just be conscious of it. Generally, if you're doing, let's say, advertisement, this is putting it under the characters is generally a better approach, okay? You can either draw a line if you're designing a specific logo or something, draw the line below it, but try just to be conscious of the closeness between the line and the characters and whether that's making it difficult, okay, to read. Okay, anybody heard of this? A ligature? You know what that might be? Okay. Okay, this is one of the things, sometimes I wish I haven't learned in graphic design school, because now I cannot stand it. I cannot stand it. It bothers me so much. So you see examples like this, okay? Traffic where the F and the I, it's very close together, right? And you see F and L, okay, there's an overlap, okay? Is it a big deal? Well, if you want to create something that's a little bit more visually pleasing, there's actually in the character set, there's specifically drawn letters to solve this problem, right? So instead of a FFI, I have this is considered a special character. Okay, so as a type designer, right, before this is installed onto your computer, then when a type designer designs his typeface, this is drawn, right? They have to draw in each individual letters. So instead of drawing just using the F and the I, they will draw a special character that accommodates this particular problem. So you have So there's a couple instances. Of course, there's the FIs and the FLs, and then we also have like FFL and then FFI. So these are all special characters. But our software, like again, is most software now will accommodate translating this to this. Okay. So next time you're in Microsoft Word, see if it does this for you, right? If you're typing FFI, does it change it to this for you? Most software should be automatic by now. So you don't actually have to deal with this particular problem. But occasionally, if they don't correct it for you, you can find them in your library of special characters, depending on the font that you downloaded. Okay? It's just one of those things we're talking about proximity, right? Since it's so close together, it actually creates a lot of tension. Okay, kerning, right? It's one of those typographic terms. It's not that important as what it's called, but in general, kerning is about how closely the letters are together. So why that is important? So let's do a little test. So which shape appears to be bigger? The square, okay. So again, this is one of those things, tricks that psychologists like to use. So Jerry is a psychologist. So what do you think is the trick here? Jerry, do you know? Yeah, so we all said that the square appeared bigger, right? But the truth here is they take up, yeah. So they're the same, they take up at the same, in terms of their width and length, they're exactly the same, right? But for some reason, the square appears bigger. Okay. This is because there's more white space, okay, around the circle. So to me, when these comes in, when they are placed by the side, even though they're exact same length and width, the square will always appear to be bigger, and that's just how our visual perception works, right? So the way this is relevant, so a lot of characters actually look like this, right? So there might be some custom adjustments you need to do so they look a little bit more even. So we have different combination, right? We have characters where they're placed against each other. There's very little white space, okay? And we have other instances where if it's a more rounder shape, we have a lot more space around, a lot more breathing room around those letters. So in general, in terms of our visual perception, this, okay, generally appears closer than that, okay? So even though, so let's look some examples, okay? So the first one is just how the program automatically sets my type. So those characters are actually placed exactly the same width apart, okay? That's just auto. The way I typed that, that's what it looks like. But we have, okay, areas like that where the L, since there's a lot of space on this side and I have this kind of rounded shape next to it, there appears to be a lot more space here than here, okay? So if you look if this comes in handy if you're, say, designing a logo, right? If you just have something like this, it looks very unprofessional. So what designers do actually to adjust the kerning letter by letter, right? So I can make the space between that smaller. I can make space between that smaller, maybe make those a little bit wider. And there's no secret formula for this. I can't just just adjust it maybe by this much, you'll get a perfect design. A lot of it it's about our perception, so how we read this information. A lot of the times it's really just about eyeballing what these look like, okay? So second one is the software program made some adjustment. If you're super, super picky like me, and it's still not happy with what the software did, you can actually go into and hand adjust these things, okay? And you can certainly do this in even like a little bit more crude program like Microsoft Word. That's not a design program. You can do things like this. This is Sonia's favorite. If you ever worked with her, you probably already heard what these are. So I'll just quickly review them, right? So do people know widows and orphans? Yeah. Huh? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
When you have like maybe an extra word or like actually like a couple characters like on a separate line.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is, okay? They're used interchangeably. Some people call them widows, some people call them orphans. If you want to get like technical, so this is essentially what a widow is, okay? You have this kind of one character. Some people call this orphans too. Again, it really doesn't matter, but this is just the case, okay? You have this one hanging word at the end of a paragraph, okay? So in design, generally people call these widows, and the orphan, generally people call it sometimes when you have this on a second page, okay? So that's even worse. But a lot of people just call that orphans in general. So you can call this orphans if you want. And this is an even worse orphan or widow, right? You have like half a broken word. And there's really like no kind of magic way to solve this. A lot of the times when we deal with it, we actually either by just decreasing the kind of the space between the characters, maybe just even by like a little hairline. If you adjust and make it a little bit wider or a little bit shorter, a couple characters will get either wrap around the previous line, or you can bump another letter to the next line, just make it a bit longer. In general, that's not very aesthetics pleasing. It just looks like it's kind of lonely at the bottom there, and you have this very jagged point sticking out. And other times when you just simply can't fix it, or you don't want to increase the width of your line, that you might just have to go back and rewrite a little bit of the copy just simply by removing a word. By communicating a different way, you can deal with this problem. Okay, and of course, when paper writing or submitting let's say conference here, I'm sure you had this problem where you have to fit within 10 pages, right? And a lot of the times we fix these orphans because you can save an entire line there. Okay, by fixing 5 of these, you can save 5 lines, and that can be really valuable in a paper where there's a very strict limit. Okay, so orphans, last line of a paragraph. Okay, if it ends up the bottom sticking out, you generally want to remove it. It doesn't matter what you call it, just basically don't do it. Okay, other kind of miscellaneous things like punctuation. Okay. In general, they should be in the same style, so generally don't use a different typeface. So this is just, I guess, basic grammar stuff. So if it's part of the entire sentence, as graduate students, I have no doubt you probably already know this, but if it's part of the sentence, punctuation goes, okay? Sorry. If the text inside the parentheses is part of the entire sentence, okay, then the punctuation goes outside. If the punctuation is part of the sentence, it goes inside of the parentheses. Okay. Paragraph indents. So we all know what indents are. It's automatic in Word, or you just press tab. Right. The appropriate spacing was 1 Okay. So if you see a very professionally set paragraph, it's generally 1 Sometimes in Microsoft Word it's too much. I think it's something like 5 spaces, okay? And that just seems like a lot. Like you see a lot of this like visual holes in your design, okay? So you can either, you can usually adjust that setting, how wide you want your indent to be. It's generally 1 okay, and I see this a lot in student essays. How are we doing for time, Sonia?
11:18.
Okay, so I'm almost just about done. So the last thing basically I want to address is that I see, so in general you have your paragraph, okay? You have another paragraph, okay? You have an indent too. So that's your paper, and other students might do this. Okay, they have the first paragraph, and then there's a bit of a space, and then they have a second paragraph. Okay, so both of these are correct. You can do either by no indent, leaving a space between paragraphs, or use indent and no space between paragraphs. The thing you want to avoid is doing both. So you don't want to use indent and space after paragraphs. Okay, so that's basically what that's about. Okay, and bullets. If you want to create a bullet, don't use hyphens. Okay, these are hyphens. Use the proper bullet points that comes with the software. Okay, and I think I'll wrap it up there. I just included this slide. You obviously don't have to remember this, but there's some useful short keyboard shortcuts you can use. It's like, oh, like I don't know. No idea where the M dashes in Microsoft Word. Sometimes they just do that automatically for you, which is great. But in general, these are the shortcuts for most programs. You might have to do a little bit of Google searching in terms of exactly what it is in the particular program you use. But if you use these a lot, it can be really, really handy. Okay. So I'll just wrap it up there. I think I have a little exercise here, but we don't have to do them. I think this is, again, it's more of a grammar problem. So what's the first one? Okay. It's versus it's. So hopefully we don't make those mistakes as a graduate student, right? Yeah. So apostrophes, generally when there's apostrophe, is taking a character away, right? So without the apostrophe, you say like, it is my birthday, right? So it would be, okay, it will be the second one. So, but I'll leave this up to you, okay? You can do this. I think the slides will be posted, right? Okay, you can take a look and to see which these for you is. And another one is the apostrophes, okay? In general, remember that they are always like lines, okay? So they will look like this, not this, okay? Okay, so I'll stick around for a little while. I think I'll wrap it up there, and then happy to answer any questions. All right, so thank you. Yeah.
So you've done a research on this?
Yeah, it's okay.
So you have done a research as a PhD student, or you?
No, this is so this is basically just kind of from experience and from example from other designers, standard practice in the industry. Yeah.
Apart from presentation, do you have some article on this, or it is not?
I can certainly include some links with the with my slides. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if you want to do some additional reading, I can also recommend some books that if you want to learn a little bit more about design. Yeah. My research is actually was with Sonia when I did my PhD. So, but I did use a lot of my design skills in my research. So I was looking at for my PhD, I was looking at improving the mental models of children's privacy knowledge. So I designed some educational materials for kids. So the design stuff certainly, certainly comes in handy, right? So, any other questions? Yeah.
At the beginning, you were talking about the reg something format versus the columns.
Yeah. Okay, I think what I was saying there is, do you mean like if it's a paragraph?
No, so I guess my question was,
yeah.
I don't know how you change that.
So I think that just basically on, okay, so you have, let's use it. This one's a bit dark. Okay. Okay. Okay, sometimes we'll have problems like this, right? And then you kind of have this really weird reg. So the way you would adjust it is with like kerning. So you could increase the space between the characters a little bit just by a little hairline. And sometimes if there's an extra word, it would get bumped to the other line.
So
or you can...
I'm thinking that I need to adjust it line by line. Is there a functionality in Word that I just click on and it...
There is not. The functionality is justified, right? The functionality is justified text. So you have left align, right align, center, and then in Word, programs like Word, there's justified. So basically your line width, it would justify for you. But what you want to avoid with justify is occasionally it would, let's say if there's the last line, it might, if the width of your paragraph, it might just like stretch your letters out, and there's a lot of space in between, and that's something you don't want. So justified, of course, you get kind of these very neat edged paragraphs, right? You have a very clean edge on both sides, but just watch it if it's kind of forcing your line to fit in some cases, that there's too much space in between. But I would say that's like the auto, a magic button that you can press where it kind of does that for you. But in general, if there's one line that's sticking out, I definitely don't do this perhaps maybe for my long format essays. But I have, let's say if I have a particular design piece and if there's just one line that's sticking out, I manually go back and adjust it. Yeah. But you can certainly use justified function in Word to do that automatically. Huh?
That's not American because it's used so much.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize it before the session. We used to use it, if you have to center line and then it spreads out the words.
Yeah. So now that you know how to adjust it, you have a little bit more control, right? It probably does an okay job 80% of the time, but then there's that 20% where you have to step in and do some manual adjustments. As professional designers, that people certainly have to do that. Okay. And then, as I said, there's no magic formula. It's not like I enter, the number 10 this will be a beautifully typeset fit. A lot of time it's like visual. It's about your visual perception, how that looks, and it's really about eyeballing it. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Oh yeah, I guess I didn't do that, huh? Okay, I will add a contact slide. Okay. Yeah.
Earlier when you were talking about like trying not to use a dark background too often, and you said it's like bad for like a lot of text. The example that you showed, would you say that was too much text for a dark background?
Which one?
Like the Shakespeare flyers.
Oh yeah, that I would say yes. Yeah, because there's still quite a bit of body text, right? So a lot of the time in design it's a trade-off, right? It's a little bit of a trade-off because so you're trading off a little bit the readability with creating something that's visually striking, right? I certainly see people create posters on a background, but maybe you can still have, in terms of how I view that poster, you can still create a very dark layout. It just doesn't mean that your text always have to appear on the, you can put like maybe like a little box around the main text, but you can still use a dark background for your poster. And there are designs, effective designs are dark, but typically it's used in areas where you don't have a lot of body text for people to read. Yeah, and on a poster it's less of an issue because again your fonts are set at a much bigger size than if you were to just read on your computer, right? Yeah, if it's like 24-point font on a dark background, it's less of an issue because maybe we can go back to that slide since we're talking about it. See if I can find it. Are you talking about this one?
Can't see.
Oh, sure. Hold it. Yeah, okay. So in general, if you were to print this, okay, so usually on screen it might look okay. If you were to print this, if it's a very thin font, right, depending on how good your printer is, you'll find that sometimes the ink will bleed into the characters a little bit. So a thin font, once it's printed, will look even thinner. So in general, what would I say is that if you're using exact same weight, on a dark background, bump up the weight of the font a little bit to make it a little bit bolder. because it will always look thinner. Like this is set exactly the same way, but this will probably look a little bit thinner than the black text. Okay? So there's different way you can kind of accommodate for it. But I think maybe for this, what I would do if I really want to go use the dark background is to, first of all, maybe use like just a slightly darker, slightly wider in terms of the weight of the font, a slightly heavier one. That will make it pop a bit more. Okay. Other questions? So I will include my contact information on this. Okay, thank you. So I'll stick around for a couple minutes too.